Okay, well, welcome. This is episode 59 of the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library, and your host for the morning. Today's meeting will be recorded to share online, and later today you'll receive a copy of the recording as well as any resources that were mentioned in today's broadcast. Just in case you're joining us for the first time, I'll let you know that the way we use Zoom is we encourage everyone to participate in the chat. You're welcome to chime in and change the setting to everyone so that we can keep the conversation going. However, if you have questions for our panelists, please put those in the Q&A section. You can also see the questions that others are asking. And if you give it a thumbs up, it will upvote the question and send it to the top of the queue if that's something that you're also interested in learning more about. Today, as part of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program at the Clements Library, we have the live machine captioning turned on. You can toggle that on or off and change the size of the font, so play around with that as needed. And we also have side-by-side mode enabled. And as you move the separator, you should be able to change the relative size of the speaker and the slides. So take some time to make sure that your screen looks as you would like it. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of the history and culture of North America and the Caribbean to about 1900. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library also acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. Okay, friends, if you haven't yet had a chance to participate in the poll, click very quickly. And I'm going to end the poll and share the results. And so people who know our collections well and or the Revolutionary War well know that the answer is all of the above. And so this collection of the Gage Papers is really wonderful with so many high points as well as so many hidden gems that we'll hear more about during today's presentation. All right, so today I'm delighted and happy to introduce Cheney Schopieray and the NEH Project Digitization Technician team, who will give us a behind-the-scenes look at the process of digitizing a large manuscript collection, as well as their unexpected discoveries and insights made by working on the Gage Papers. Cheney began working in the manuscripts division of the Clements Library in 2002. He became assistant curator of manuscripts in 2009 and Curator of Manuscripts in 2013. He obtained his MSI degree from the University of Michigan School of Information in 2009 with a specialization in archives and records management. Michelle Varteresian earned her bachelor's and master's degrees in history from Wayne State University in 1997 and 2005. She also has graduate certificates in archival administration and human resources management. Tulin Babbitt graduated from the University of Maryland in 2018 with a BA in history, concentrating in society and culture. She went on to receive her MSI in digital archives and library science from the University of Michigan. Katrina Shafer is a two-time graduate of the University of Michigan. She obtained her BA in Screen Arts and Cultures and Communication Studies in 2015 and completed her MSI from the School of Information with a focus on digital curation in 2020. I'm so delighted to welcome you all to the Bookworm this morning. So thank you so much for being here. So I'm hoping that Cheney can get us started with telling us a little bit about Thomas Gage, and that will just help give us some background for the rest of this conversation.
Yes, thank you, Angela. As you mentioned, I've been here at the Clements Library for about 20 years, and that's a long time to spend with Thomas Gage and with the other over 200 collections of Revolutionary War manuscript collections, as well as the abundance of printed and visual materials we have pertinent to the same subjects. So I am grateful every day for that opportunity. And so I offer my greetings to everyone who's joining today to share in a very small piece of that in the next hour or so. This conversation that we'll have today is going to focus and largely be led by Tulin and Katrina and Michelle, respecting their work on digitizing Thomas Gage's papers. And what I'd like to do, as Angela mentioned, is just provide a very necessarily brief description of who Thomas Gage is and what his papers consist and what this digitization grant entails. If we can move to the next slide. I'm trying to imagine how to encapsulate the life and career of an extraordinary human being, Thomas Gage, who was involved in an abundance of different administrative and military operations over the course of his career. He was a career military officer, and I've listed on the right just a few of the activities and positions that he was part of during the course of that career. But largely, what we would focus on in the context of these papers is the time that he spent in the American colonies. He was there about roughly 20 years, with trips home as well, of course, from about 1775 until the outbreak of just after the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775. He served under Jeffrey Amherst during the French and Indian War, the American colonial, the French and Indian War. He, from 1763 until 1775, he served as commander-in-chief of the British Army in North America. And during that time, of course, there were large changes happening in the Americas. securing land from the Treaty of Paris in 1763, negotiating interactions with the indigenous tribes. He oversaw the handling, for example, of Pontiac's War and Bouquet's expedition afterwards. He responded to civil and political unrest, which, of course, during these years included sort of these flashpoints like the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts during the 1760s. Gage was there, but as head of the military in North America, he was also the senior officer overseeing. He was overseeing the North American colonies, but more than just a military general. So if you think of the commander-in-chief as sort of the single most powerful British official in the Americas, he was responsible for the management of all territory there east of the Mississippi River, including Canada. So if you think of him something more like a chief executive or almost a head of state, it sort of can help clarify the range of scholarship that his papers can support, as well as understand the types of correspondence and documents within the collection. So before I move on to discuss sort of the papers themselves, on the left you see a hitherto unrecorded 2¼ inch or so oval miniature portrait of Thomas Gage. This was taken very late in his life, in the last couple years of his life, by artist Jeremiah Meyer, 1785 to 1787 sometime, because he's wearing a particular colonel's uniform for a dragoon regiment, the 11th. It was discovered by Christopher Bryant and acquired by the Clements Library just last year, thanks to generosity of Benjamin and Bonnie Upton, as well as Margaret Trumbull. We can go to the next slide. The collection itself is just over 23,000 letters, documents, financial papers, maps, and other materials that provide both a broad scale picture of what's happening in the Americas and across the Atlantic, as well as minutiae of local activity and everyday individuals' lives during especially the 1760s to early 1770s. So the papers were acquired from the Gage family, from Henry Gage in 1930, the Viscount at that time. And Mr. Clements brought them to his home in Bay City, Michigan after the purchase. And they came to Ann Arbor to be part of his library on the settlement of his estate in 1937. So we think of the Thomas Gage Papers, and many, I suspect many of you who are in attendance have made use of the Thomas Gage Papers at different times, or at very least, read historical writings that include content based on them. But the Gage Papers are much broader than just the English and American series that are the most researched materials in the collection, as well as the most researched and utilized materials at the Clements Library overall. On an annual basis, they continue to be the most used papers here. What was actually acquired and what was actually brought overseas from England are these groups of materials listed on the left. Part of them is an English series, which is about 30 volumes of materials. And that's largely letters between Gage and military and political office and politicians in England, secretaries of state and secretaries of war, the Treasury, the Board of Trade, Ordnance, the Paymaster General, and other officials associated with them. Then there's about 139 volumes of Gage's correspondence with military and civil authorities in North America, such as colonial governors, generals, commanders and subordinate officers, superintendents of Indian affairs, the British Navy, Army contractors, and so on and so forth. 17 volumes of letter and account books, as well as a series of warrants respecting the pay of the British military. There's about 40 volumes of those. Then there are also Peter Warren papers, the Jeffrey Amherst papers, the William Skinner papers, which are described separately here at the Clements, but they were part of Gage's papers as well. Thomas Gage, his son Henry, married into the Warren and Skinner families, and so these materials came here as well, including content related to the siege of Louisburg and Cape Breton Island, 1745, and so on and so forth. So that I don't spend too much time talking, very quickly, next slide. The digitization of these papers is made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has had an interest in Gage's papers for quite some time. My predecessor and mentor, Barbara DeWolf, secured an NEH grant to process the collection and create subject and name indices for the papers themselves, to get them described in a very thorough way, so that they could be better utilized and identified by researchers for their topics of interest. And then in 2020, we applied for the Digitizing the Thomas Gage Papers grant, which was successful. And to the NEH, we owe gratitude for being able to digitize these materials at this time, which is around the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. And so this historical content is particularly poignant at this time for the United States. You can go to the next slide. This involved the grant itself. This digitization grant involved rehousing the collection because the materials couldn't be digitized in the volumes into which they were tipped. You can see one of those volumes on the left, and you can see the rehoused boxes on the right. Go to the next slide. And then once the materials were rehoused, they needed to be scanned. Every page, including blank pages, are scanned for every single item, and information about each of those items was collected so that it can all be made available online. On the left is Katrina, who will speak in a few minutes, and on the right is an example for a snapshot of a page from the materials that are currently online. I am going to leave it at that for now and pass it along to Michelle to talk about something about the process of the collection, of digitizing the collection.
Good morning, I am Michelle Varteresian, and this morning I would like to present a very brief overview for you of the process of metadata creation and digitization. The process of metadata creation is a multi-step process in which individual pieces of information must be gleaned from a manuscript and entered into an Excel spreadsheet. I adopt a holistic approach, first visually scanning the entire document to get a feel for the flow of the content. I then focus on the specific details necessary to generate the metadata. Challenges can include deciphering handwriting and identifying the penmanship and writing style of the creator as opposed to that of confidential secretaries. Identifying the locality and date can also be challenging, as this information can be found either on the first page or on the last page. In many instances, documents are multi-page and dates are often written out in longhand. Additionally, many correspondents had their own particular style and often use different formats to display this information. Another challenge in creating metadata is identifying the correspondence involved. In some cases, dockets are incomplete, and in others, they are absent altogether, as often is the case with copied materials and enclosures. This slide describes a bit about the challenges of generating metadata from a document. In this example, the recipient, William Barrington, the second Viscount Barrington, is easily identified from the lower left-hand corner of the letter. However, the writer in this case, Thomas Gage, was identified based on experience working with copies of Gage's letters, which comprise a great number of the manuscripts in his papers. From my experience, it is custom that a copy such as this was often penned by one of Gage's secretaries, hence the abbreviation ETC, etc., representing the signature of Thomas Gage. Reading into the letter, it is soon revealed that Gage is speaking about the Boston Massacre, describing the event as a, quote, unfortunate accident, and the beginning of a, quote, quarrel and its fatal consequences, end quote. Once the metadata has been generated, the next step in the workflow is to digitize the manuscript. This is achieved by placing the document on the scanner bed and generating a preview scan to ensure alignment with the target or ruler. Scans are completed in 48-24-bit, and a sequential number is automatically assigned to each individual scan. Images are then saved into a dedicated file folder specific to this project. The images on this next slide are screenshots from Lightroom Classic, our image organization processing software. The files that have been generated from the scanning process are imported in batches into this program for straightening of the image and additional cropping. As you can see, alignment of the image is perfected in this step. Once this is achieved, the image is transferred to a separate folder. And once the metadata has been proofread and edited, it is wed to its image and made ready for eventual upload into the Thomas Gage website. Our digitization specialist, Chris Ridgway, uses industry standard targets for digitizing and balancing color and luminosity to produce the most accurate digital representation of the original manuscripts. Each target has color information and is also used for scale, as the target has measurement information. The image of the software interface shows a preview on one side, the left, where the target is recognized by the color correcting program, and then a second corrected image after being processed, which is displayed on the right. As you can see in this example, the suite of software that is used in the digitization process provides exceptional clarity of image. Here we see an embossed stamp identifying the amount of the tax for this document, resulting from the implementation of the 1765 Stamp Act in Quebec. And now I am more than happy to turn the presentation over to my colleagues, Tulin and Katrina, who will share some compelling stories from the Gage Papers with us.
Thank you, Michelle. Can we go to the next slide, Angela? Wonderful. Hi, I'm Tulin, and I just wanted to use my time to highlight one of my favorite letters that I've come across while digitizing the Thomas Gage collection. You can go to the next slide, Angela. So this is a letter from Thomas Gage to Henry Seymour Conway, who was the Secretary of State for the Southern Department, which at the time included administration of the British colonies. At the time that this 12-page letter was written, Conway had just started in his position as Secretary of State. So Gage uses this letter to just catch Conway up to speed with everything that's been happening in the colonies. And he starts the letter by discussing British relationships with various native tribes. He then talks about the French inhabitants in the Illinois country who are really not happy that they are now under English control. Gage then reviews some administrative technicalities in British Canada and British West Florida before moving on to an absolutely incredible account of the Stamp Act riots in the colonies. Next slide, please. So Gage starts his account with this line. Though you will have received accounts from the governors of the several provinces of the clamor, tumults, and riots that the Stamp Act has occasioned in the colonies, yet as the clamor has been so general, it may be expected, sir, that I would likewise transmit you some account of what has passed. Next, he writes this. The Assembly of Virginia gave the signal for a general outcry over the continent. They have been applauded as the protectors and asserters of American liberty. This line particularly really stuck out to me, as I believe this is the first or the earliest mention in the Thomas Gage collection of that concept of liberty, American liberty specifically. In the next portion of the letter, Gage details the efforts to pressure the stamp officers to resign their posts by menace or by force, and how the rioters have been, for the most part, pretty successful in doing that. And additionally, how they have been destroying stamped papers in the hope that this would convince the assemblies to repeal the Stamp Act. Next, Thomas Gage goes into the events happening in individual colonies, and he writes that the populace of Boston took the lead in the riots, and the little turbulent colony of Rhode Island raised their mob likewise, which is not really how I would describe Rhode Island today. In the next slide, Gage goes on to describe the violence, the destruction, and the looting occurring in the colonies before saying this. The people then began to be terrified at the spirit they had raised, to perceive that popular fury was not to be guided, and each individual feared that he might be the next victim, which I think gives a real sense of the, almost like the anarchy that Gage perceived to be happening as a result of the riots in the colonies. Next, Gage concludes his account with this paragraph, which seems to indicate that he is well aware that this will not be the end of the protests. Everything is quiet at present, and a calm seems to have succeeded the storm. But Gage acknowledges that as the Stamp Act isn't going to take effect until the 1st of November, the final issue of this affair will soon be determined. So for me, this letter is so incredible because it holds, I believe, the first implications in the Thomas Gage collection of the revolution that's going to follow. And it's detailing such an important event in our history. I think anyone who has studied US history would probably recognize the Stamp Act riots. But in this country, we always learn about it from like this heroic colonial perspective. And here in this letter, we get to read about it from the British perspective. And it's documents like this one that make the Thomas Gage collection so popular. But on that note, I would like to hand it over to Katrina to discuss some of the other stories that are in the Thomas Gage Papers.
Thank you. Hello. So Tulin has provided this excellent example of this monumental event in the collection. And so I want to zoom in and show you a series of letters that provide insight into one person's life, specifically a lower class working woman named Mrs. Cahoon. I do want to note sometimes her name is spelled with an O instead of an A, and some other scholarship has referred to her as Mrs. Calhoun. Her first name is never referred to within the letters, but it appears to have either been May or Mary. I'm just going to say Mrs. Cahoon the whole time because that is how she is referred to in the letters. And so she is the subject of a series of letters between Captain Lieutenant Charles Osborne, the commanding officer of Ticonderoga, and Lieutenant Colonel John Beckwith, who is at Crown Point. And I'm going to present this series of letters in the same order that Gage received them. So if we look at the first letter here, so this is from Charles Osborne, and he tells Gage that Gage's late servant, Mrs. Cahoon, has applied to him for protection because her husband, James Cahoon, has been mistreating her. So as a result, Osborne sends James Cahoon to his barrack room to be apart from his wife, and he really presents himself as being noble in this action. But if we go to the next letter, we get a very different side of the story from John Beckwith. So this is John Beckwith writing to Gage, and he tells Gage that private soldier James Cahoon told him that he caught his captain in bed with his wife. That captain, of course, would be Charles Osborne. When Cahoon said that when he complained to Osborne, Osborne then imprisoned him for 10 days. So Cahoon asks Beckwith to send his wife away from Ticonderoga to live with other family. And Beckwith includes that Cahoon told him this in front of the gentlemen of the mess, and because it was after dinner, everyone was there to hear it. There is even a rare exclamation point after this to really underscore Beckwith's feelings about this. So if we go next, we have a copy of a letter from John Beckwith to Osborne that addresses the situation. So he recounts to Osborne what Cahoon told him, and that Cahoon has, quote, reason to imagine you are very intimate with her being Mrs. Cahoon, and that Beckwith has sufficient reason to believe her a very bad woman. We also get a little information about the Cahoons and that they have been married for 17 years. And then Beckwith appeals to Osborne, quote, for were it your own case, you would think it very hard to have your wife live with a person as he supposes, and to be deprived of his property. So if we go to the next letter, we get a copy of Osborne's response to Beckwith's allegations. And they include insight into how Osborne describes Mrs. Cahoon. He says that she is a washerwoman, person who takes care of our cows, our servant, but he also says that, quote, she has an undoubted right to get her bread by working from whom and where she pleases. He then describes James Cahoon as absolutely the worst man that lives, but he concedes that forsooth she is his wife, and consequently, he may break her arms and legs if it's any diversion to him. Further in this letter, he recounts an incident wherein James Cahoon got most egregiously drunk, and Osborne believes that he would have murdered his wife. And then he ends by telling Beckwith that he is solely accountable to the commander-in-chief, who of course would be Thomas Gage. Next, we get Beckwith's response to Osborne again. He tells Osborne that Cahoon has a right not only to demand his wife, but to take her wherever he can find her to live with him if he chooses it, and no one has a right to keep her from him. He does admit that Cahoon is a poor, drunken, unhappy fellow who at times does not know what he does or says, but again, he appeals to Osborne to send her down the country, so to family, and then he threatens that if Osborne doesn't comply with this, he will recount this whole incident to Gage. So it does seem that Osborne did not comply with this, considering we only know about this incident because all of these letters were sent to Gage. So finally, how did Gage respond to all of this? He tells Beckwith that Osborne commands independently, which to me reads as stay out of it, doesn't concern you. He tells Osborne that if he has in fact confined this man, he needs to go through the proper channels and bring him to trial. So this series of letters raises a lot of questions for me. I mean, first, based on how he's described, is Cahoon a reliable narrator? Did Osborne and his wife actually have a relationship? If they did, as Beckwith seems to believe based on Beckwith's actions, how do they feel about each other? Are they both using each other? Does Osborne really believe that a woman has the right to make a living, or is he kind of covering for his own actions and interests? And then most of all, and of course unanswered, is what does Mrs. Cahoon want? You know, everybody's talking about what should be done with her, but we never hear from her. So even though we never get answers to any of these, they do provide insight into how gender and class were viewed by the ruling class, and they functioned in the 1760s American colonies. And this is just one example of how this collection offers views into the lives of people other than the authors of the letters. So if we go to the next slide now, that you've seen a small portion of what the collection has to offer, I'm going to show you how you can actually look at the documents that are online right now. So if you want to go ahead and play the video, this is how to get there from our homepage. So we go to the top and we choose Explore Collections and then Digitized Collections, and then Digitized Archival Collections. And you can check out our other digitized archival collections while you're here, but we, of course, want to look at the Gage Papers. And then if you scroll down, we get the collection overview. You can see all that is to come, but we, of course, are going to the English series. and the first 11 volumes are on right now. And then we're actually going to go to the letter that Tulin highlighted, which I know is in the 4th volume. And then we have the date and who it's to and from. And so you can see all of the pages on the left side there. You can see we can zoom in and out. We can toggle between them all. And then I know that we want to go to page 5 because that is where they talk about Boston and Little Rhode Island. And then hopefully in the chat, we've also put where the collection is and then this specific letter as well. So again, you can also see how clear it is to read, which is what Michelle was talking about with how clear these scans are. And then if we go to the next slide, I'll also just highlight that you will be able to look at the metadata that we created and also download as well. Can we go to the next slide, Angela? Okay, perfect. So yeah, along the right-hand side there, if you don't want to look at it online, if you want to download it and have it, you know, available offline, you're able to download an image or a PDF of each individual page, or you can download a PDF, of the entire document itself. So with that, we hope you will stick around for the Q&A and then also take some time to explore the collection yourself, and I will turn it back to Angela.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section. And I'm just going to do a couple of housekeeping slides before we continue with the Q&A. And we are going to have a wonderful in-person Adopt a Piece of History Fest on Wednesday, November 15th from 4:30 to 6:30 p.m. That'll be in person at the Clements Library. More information to come, so watch your inboxes for that. The Ann Arbor Antiquarian Book Fair is coming up on Sunday, October 1st from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. at the Michigan Union in the Rogel Ballroom. Admission is $5 and the proceeds benefit the Clements Library. It's really a fun day to take a look at all of the wonderful things that the dealers bring to sell, and also just to have some camaraderie. So I hope to see many of you there. We are partnering with the Michigan Photographic Historical Society for their annual meeting on October 7th from 3 to 5:30 p.m. at the Michigan League. The guest speaker is Jacob McCormick, who is the photo archivist and educator for the Michigan State Capitol Commission. That is free and open to the public. So we look forward to seeing you there if that's of interest to you. He is going to talk about the history of panoramas and how they're executed and some fun examples from Michigan history. And just a reminder that our centennial exhibit, Building on a Century of Collecting at the Clements Library, continues to be on display until mid-November. You can come see it from noon to 4, Monday through Friday, or we also have some guided tours available, especially next week during homecoming. So please consider joining us to take a look at that exhibit. There is also an extended version of that exhibit online. So even if you can't make it to Ann Arbor, you can see the online exhibit. Next month's Bookworm will be on October 20th, once again at 10 a.m. Since you are signed up for the Bookworm, you'll receive a reminder next month, and you can choose to watch in person, or you will receive a email just like today of the recording and the resources mentioned. Next month, we'll be having a wonderful discussion with university libraries about one of their most famous and first acquisition, the Birds by Audubon, and discussing how it's another behind the scenes look, really. How do we continue to think about these archival materials and present them in the most comprehensive way, and think about showcasing not only perhaps the well-known names that like Audubon's, but also all of the people who he interacted with in order to create his masterworks. So the women who were coloring, and Native Americans who were providing knowledge, and slaves. And so it should be a really good discussion. And Gregory Nobles will also be joining us for that discussion. All righty, so we love to have all of you involved and participate in the discussion. If you're interested also in sponsoring an episode of the Bookworm, you can reach out to Anne or myself, and we'd be happy to help match you up with a topic that you're passionate about. Okay. And now we'll get on to the Q&A, because I see that there are already lots and lots of questions. So that's fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Oh, this is an interesting one from Tom Wagner. How does Gage's reactions or opinions to the evolving revolution change over time? I don't know.
Try to answer that. I don't know about change over time. I will definitely say he seems to have a very negative opinion of the revolution, of the Sons of Liberty, of the colonialists. He definitely calls them like scoundrels and like very provincial. And his sympathy in the letters is definitely very limited.
I think also sometimes it can be, we definitely can gain insight into how he feels about it, but they are at the end of the day administrative documents. So he definitely does try to not let like a ton of emotion show in it.
Oh, that's a good point. Interesting. All right. Cheney, do you have anything else to add to that?
I think Katrina gave the sort of answer I would have also given, is that it's difficult to tell, like on a personal level, sort of what Gage's reactions and personal, his personal thoughts are. But I mean, it's a frustrating situation to be in, and in earlier 20th century biographical content related to American service and others, there's sort of less sympathetic view given to him on account of not being able to restrain the growing discontent in the colonies. But more recent scholarship has been much more sympathetic to the realities of his position and his decision-making abilities, and what he is and isn't able to do on the ground. And I think that more recent scholarship is certainly providing a more nuanced investigation into those questions. So.
Thank you. All right, so Philip is wondering roughly what percentage of the Gage papers are official copies compared to the original letters?
I can I don't know if I can give a percentage. I think it depends on if you're talking about the letters that are from Gage or from other people, because essentially if they're from Gage, they are a copy, and so they are made by his secretary. Like his secretary is making a copy so that he can then refer back to whatever he told his correspondent. And oftentimes too, you'll even see these copies, then he can always copy from them and send an extract to somebody else, again, to refer back to whatever he said to someone else. So most of them that are from Gage are copies, and that's why, like, the example that Tulin showed has this beautiful handwriting because it is from a secretary who has very practiced handwriting. Like that is their job, to make it very clear. But most of the letters that he receives are the originals, either written by the person or often signed by the person, depending on their rank and whether they too have a secretary or not. So I hope that kind of answered it.
Yeah, I add to that, I also don't have a particular percentage, but one of the really marvelous things about the Gage papers as they exist is that it is, secretarial copies of retained correspondence as well as the incoming letters, so you get sort of the full correspondence in sort of one contained body of materials. You'll find, for example, the originals of the outgoing letters and other documentation that accompanied them at the archives at Kew in England. You'll find in Colonial Office records, the War Office records, and so on over there, and a variety of miscellaneous Gage pieces still float around and occasionally are in private collections still. But I think the exciting thing about this collection and what makes it a particular value to research is that it is sort of this comprehensive, contained group of the correspondence that's taking place at that time.
Thank you. Okay, so I have two questions about using the Gage papers. And so one is wondering if now related to searching in the digitized papers, is one able to search the digitized collection by keyword or name?
So with the metadata that's being collected and turned into sort of the various indices almost of the collection, you can search through those writer and recipient names. The ultimate goal, so the NEH grant is specifically to get the materials digitized and to create that metadata. As you might imagine, getting transcriptions of the entire set of 23,000 letters, documents, account books, and so on would be an extraordinary effort. And is not part of the grant itself. So we're focusing on getting the materials scanned, described, and put online currently. But we're also at the moment investigating sort of the next step, which is probably, but not guaranteed, but probably we'll be utilizing some form of the machine learning through artificial intelligence to be able to gain transcriptions of this material. So much of it is in a relatively uniform English roundhand. It's a good candidate for that type of project, and we're investigating that currently. Once that's done, then it would be a matter of being able to search through the contents of the entire collection, including names. So
Thank you. So the second question, Philip's asking, if we have a question about trying to find a letter in the Gage papers, who might be the appropriate person to contact?
Clements Library reference.
Yes. And it also can be helpful to check out the finding aid, correct?
Yes, yeah, going through the finding aid, you'll, as I mentioned earlier, in that first NEH grant, we created what are linked from the finding aid are these indices of subjects and names and so on that may be able to provide the ability to narrow down your search to a letter or a clutch of letters that might be useful to you for that research, and then asking reference for something as part of that process as well.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, my colleagues pasted the link to the finding aid and then also how to contact the reference staff into the chat. So take a look at that. All right, so the next one, I don't know if anybody's had a chance to read it, but Robert Orr is just wondering if anyone's read The Revolutionary Samuel Adams, and to see if you had any comments on it.
Haven't read it, but I always accept book recommendations, so that will go on my list.
I was going to say the same. I haven't read it, but this seems like an excellent recommendation.
And I've already added it to my ever expanding list of materials to read on the Revolution. So
Yes, so thank you, Robert, for mentioning that. Sorry, we don't have any comments right now. So Bruce, I think this is an excellent question too. He's wondering, was Gage an exceptionally careful, i.e. compulsive record keeper, or are we just not lucky enough to have similar collections of correspondence from among Gage's peers?
yeah, so we do have, there are similar collections like Gage's papers in different locations. You know, he's corresponding largely in an official capacity, and so, you know, retaining correspondence and copies of correspondence for use and reference by him at the time is something that's valuable. So when the collection arrived at the Clements Library, it was in 12 trunks, many of them with pigeonholes marked out from various posts and geographical locations. So you can imagine a secretary in 1764 who's keeping track of and retaining correspondence sent and received from a particular location. Down the road, 2 months later, when Gage needs to reference communications that are made, the secretary will be able to go into those trunks, will be able to find the materials that may be useful to Gage, and identify the information that could help him with whatever is going on at the time. So that's not particularly unusual to retain and keep those types of correspondence. Whether or not those collections remain intact over time is a different question. On quite a number of Gage's peers' papers continued to survive. So, for example, you know, if we look at the other commanders-in-chief of the British Army in North America during the 18th century, the later 18th century, you know, Guy Carleton's papers are essentially together. The papers of Henry Clinton are together at the Clements Library. Now, I might describe as a compulsive record keeper because he saved much more than a typical administrator might. And that's a conversation for when we digitize the Clinton papers, which will be after Gage. Yeah, so I don't think Gage would be sort of I don't think he'd be considered a compulsive record keeper as much as a competent administrator, in my view. Katrina, Tulin, Michelle.
The only thing I would note is that we're also lucky that they survived, not only together, but just like there are pages that we come across that have, you know, appeared to have like bugs have eaten out of them or other things. And so, you know, the fact that we received them and then have been able to take good care of them and do conservation work is also, you know, part of it as well, and how I see it.
Right. Yeah, because they were certainly transporting those trunks all over the countryside. So any number of things could have befallen them. All right. Kristen's asking, is thinking a little bit more about the sending and receiving of the letters and wondering how they were transported from the sender to the recipient. And, you know, were they folded up a certain way? How were they addressed? So.
I will jump in again. So much of, because again of the official nature of much of Gage's correspondence in this collection, and Tulin, Katrina, Michelle, you can jump in if there's exceptions, but many of them are just simply trifold letters that are sent in bundles and transported either overseas or to the posts where they're going. And that could be any of a variety of different methods of transmission. You know, in the English series, for example, when Gage sends his letters, he retains the draft. And then not uniformly, but many times he identifies exactly what ship it's traveling on, as well as in cases the captain of the ship that it's going on. And if you look at them as a group, you can actually follow, like, okay, so this ship left on this date, and you can almost create a list of what he sent on that ship if you wanted to bring that data together. But as far as the between posts on the ground in the Americas, do any of you want to make a remark about notations about methods of transport?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit. I was going to say I have less to say about how they were actually sent and more about how they're addressed, because Michelle talked about the docket that often goes on the back. So not all of them, but typically the letter is like front, back, and then another page, and then the docket is on the back of it. And the docket actually says who it's to and from. If it's a letter that Gage sent, it will be, you know, who Gage is sending it to and where they are located when he sent it. If it's something that Gage has received, often his secretary will put that same information and put the date that he received it. That's especially really interesting when he's getting things to and from England, because you can see how long it takes for things to get from one place to another and how delayed their actions can be because it takes so long to, you know, share information such a distance. And then, yeah, sometimes it will say, you know, it is sent in this loop or whatever. And also when things are being sent to England, Gage will often send multiple copies, and sometimes we will have multiple copies of the same letter, and then you can see when that letter was received and then when the copy was received, so you can see which traveled faster as well.
The thing I always enjoy seeing is it'll say sent with a packet. So there's several copies of correspondence or original correspondence that's sent all together. And my favorite in dealing with some of the manuscripts, particularly John Stewart, who was head of one of the Indian departments, multiple enclosures could be sent with one letter. And I've had as many as between 8 and 12 enclosures for a single letter communicating information, what's going on with the native tribes. And as I may have alluded to, not all of the enclosures have dockets. So trying to ensure that you're tying that enclosure to the correct letter sometimes can be a challenge.
Thank you. So Wendy's asking a question about whether there are resources available for researchers to digitize documents using the processes described. And so,
So we haven't created sort of a step-by-step how we are doing the Gage papers, but it's based on work done by other institutions who are doing similar work. So there are a variety of different types of sort of how-to documents produced by other libraries like the Clements. But that's something that we should be producing as part of the final reporting for the Gage papers. So that's something we can make available at some point, but it's not available currently.
Yeah, and Wendy, if you're asking about researching materials at the Clements Library that aren't yet digitized, then that's a kind of different question, because we do have a digital fellowship by which we will digitize a small collection. So yes, so reach out to that reference email if you have more questions about those kinds of something at the Clements. All right, so Cheryl is wondering where Gage was during 1775 to 1782 and what his actual participation was during the war.
So during the American Revolutionary conflict on the ground from 1775 to 1782, Gage was not in the Americas. Gage had been recalled to London in the fall of 1775, and that's with only a few minor exceptions. That's sort of where the Thomas Gage papers end here at the Clements Library, chronologically speaking. He did continue in the British military, and so he's involved in at Flanders in the early 1780s. He's on Amherst's staff, preparing defenses against the French, but just not involved in American affairs, at least in in his military capacity.
So related to that, both Cheryl and Art are wondering if he was corresponding with and about what was going on in the Americas. And so do we see any interactions between Gage and Clinton?
Tulin, Katrina, have you come across Clinton materials in Gage? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I haven't reached that point yet. I haven't come across them, and I'm not to the years in which I would more expect that to happen.
I've recently come across some correspondence between Gage and William Howe. So I'm far enough along where Howe is now making his presence known.
1775. We're getting there in the scanning process. Yeah, it's exciting. When we digitize the Clinton papers in the future, we'll find that there's minimal early material that has some Gage in it, but what you have is Gage leaving the Americas in 1775, and William Howe takes over as commander-in-chief during the earliest stages of the revolution, and Clinton doesn't sort of come to the fore until 1778. But Clinton also had time in America, so it's an interesting question. When we manage to get the materials transcribed, we'll have to scour for the Clintons.
Cheney, I know that you covered this very briefly in your introduction, but Dave is asking the story of why and how the Gage family decided to donate, which, first of all, they weren't donated, Gage's documents to an American collector. Could you maybe tell that story a little in a little more detail?
I could describe it in a lot of detail, but given a very short period of time, I'll give the broad, a sort of broad picture of it. So, in the case of Mr. Clements, we're looking at a period just after World War I, where you have these sort of wealthy financiers and industrialists in the United States who are collecting historical materials of various kinds. One of the chief examples tends to be J.P. Morgan, who was just acquiring everything under the sun in the realm of antiques and papers and so on. But other contemporaries of Mr. Clements, like Henry Huntington, they were all acquiring papers by just going and buying huge lots of material that were going up for auction, as there's this sort of rising death taxes and sort of financial slump in England after the First World War. You get people like Huntington, Clements, and others just buying whole libraries that are being sold. As far as the Gage papers particularly, Mr. Clements engaged in correspondence directly with the Viscount at around that time. Clements had just acquired, he had acquired the papers of Lord Shelburne, Prime Minister during the peace negotiations at the end of the Revolution, which were being sold by Sotheby's. He had acquired the papers of Henry Clinton in 1925, arrived in 26 in the States, directly from a family negotiation, and then worked directly with the Gages to make that purchase. Part of this project, and something that I very much want to investigate as part of this, is to have some communication with and look into records that aren't strictly from the perspective of Mr. Clements and Dr. Adams, our first director, to get a better picture of exactly what that transaction looked like, from the side of the family that sold them. It's certainly not it's not unusual at that time for that type of transaction to happen, but we're very interested in sort of the human side of all of these transactions in history, from the Revolution to how the papers came here. So changing that picture of that has so often been told about from the stateside perspective of how it's almost like a heroic sort of story of the papers returning back to America, of the sort of grand acquisition of Mr. Clements in the face of competing collectors. Those stories have sort of grounding in reality, but it's such a small picture of the bigger story of what the Gage's perspectives were on that sale and why those decisions were made. So
Thank you. Do we know who Gage's secretaries were during the 1760s, and do we know anything about them?
Yes, there are 4 that I've found, and there's not a whole lot of biographical information about a couple of them, but Gabriel Maturin was a friend of Gage, and he was one of his secretaries. Now, this is going to go probably past the 1760s. There was a Thomas Moncrief, who was also a secretary to Gage. And although it's not explicitly mentioned in Gage's papers that I've seen, there was an interesting side story with Moncrief. His daughter was forced into a marriage at a very young age with a man whom she did not want to marry. So that's kind of a tantalizing bit that would merit further investigation to see if at any point Gage was aware of this. I've not seen anything to indicate it. And the other two I've seen either listed as secretaries or aides de camp were his two brothers-in-law, Stephen Kemble and Samuel Kemble. So there's four that I'm aware of. If there were any more of that, I'm not sure of. But
Thank you. Is that, Cheney, is that like a typical number for somebody of his stature?
I would have to look specifically at what the different secretaries were doing. You know, but 4 doesn't seem unreasonable, you know, or you know, you have cabinet members with 2 or 3 secretaries, primary secretaries, and then there are others who will, you know, who are sometimes unsigned, you know, or unidentified, who might do 1 or 2 sheets that need to be done, an adjutant or something in the army. But,
Okay.
but the prime secretaries, that's not an unusual number. No.
Thank you.
Over the course of, you know, a decade. So.
So let's see. Tim is wondering if the papers reference political actions taken by Parliament or politicians. Are there any insights to his thoughts regarding Edmund Burke?
I've not seen anything related directly to Edmund Burke, but yes, the papers that I've gone through, there are acts of Parliament. Some of them have official seals affixed to them. And other correspondence I've read involve jurisdictional disputes between Gage and the civilian authorities. And Gage seemed loath to interfere in civilian matters and seemed to have a demarcation between the military aspect, which was his role, and the civilian. And he always was very, very careful in his approach. If anything was getting where he thought it should be more handled by the civilian authorities. So he was very, very cautious in his approach, at least the correspondence that I've seen.
From just a little broader perspective, you know, Gage's activities and what he did not include creating policy. You know, he's receiving parliamentary and political material from overseas that help instruct him or sort I say help him, but sort of give him the confines of sort of what he needs to be focused on and what the general political approach is and what limitations are. And then he's got to implement that on the ground. So yeah, I mean, he's learning and reacting to and handling in his capacity a lot of political instruction. And but I'd be interested, Katrina, Tulin, have you come across anything like what Michelle's talking about, like his thoughts on parliamentary acts? Or
yeah, I would say, again, it's just he tries to, because they're administrative documents, it's, you know, you want more from him, but he's still kind of keeping it close to his chest because of being a government official. I mean, he definitely, you know, talks about various things. Like Michelle said, we have, you know, copies of different things, but yeah.
There was one letter I came across where he was talking about the repeal of the Stamp Act. And he's quoted as saying, "I'm confident that the Stamp Act will be repealed." I don't recall him actually offering an opinion per se, just stating what he thought would be the ultimate outcome with the Stamp Act being repealed. So.
I was going to say, I do recall in the English series that he occasionally has private letters between him and, I want to say the first Baron Mendip. And in those letters, he does occasionally offer a little bit more of an opinion, still nothing like super controversial. but he is a little bit more like free with his opinions in those private letters.
Thank you. I noticed that we have a question from Pamela, and she was just wondering about some more of the surprises that you all found in the collection.
Yes. I found copies of meeting transcripts between Native American tribes and the British, which are signed, if I can use that term loosely, with British secretarial copies of native totems. These are animal representations of the Native American names, which have been translated. I've seen other accounts that describe in poignant detail the situation of one particular chief, and I'm going to mispronounce his name, I apologize, Amina Boju, who's talking about the hardships him and his family are facing due to starvation. Stories like that always capture my attention. One of the other things that I've seen was a paper design of a peace medal that was developed at the conclusion of Pontiac's War that's actually affixed to one of the manuscripts that I've already digitized. So I pay particular attention to anything related Native American, because that's, at least from my perspective, where I found many of the most interesting, poignant, and informative bits of information that kind of give a broader perspective and kind of humanize people and humanize what's going on. We see so much administrative correspondence. This actually personalizes it a little bit, and I think helps people relate to the collection and to some of the people who appear throughout the collection.
Yeah, I think some of the most surprising things to me are, again, the things that aren't administrative, or maybe they end up getting in these administrative documents, but they tell a more personal story. So like the example that I included of these series of letters about Mrs. Cahoon, there are lots of enclosures that go over different affidavits or different trials that really provide insight into people who may not be military figures or are related to military figures. Those are definitely places where you find these more personal stories. And I think those are the things that are always surprising to me. Maybe not as surprising, but some of my favorite things are the gifts that Gage is given. He is given turtles to make turtle soup. He is given different small mammals to clothe Mrs. Gage. And so those are like the insights into like food and day-to-day life, I think are also things you might not think of in this collection that is known for like these big monumental events. And so, yeah, I personally would look at enclosures and different court trials if you want to find things that are, those smaller personal stories like that.
Tulin, do you have any to add?
I was going to say, kind of in a similar vein. So these letters, this collection is a professional collection. These letters are very like serious and formal. Everyone in it is very professional. But every once in a while, I will come across a letter which might make me pause and be like, oh, these two men, they were friends. Like they had a close relationship with each other. I think primarily of James Murray, who was, I want to say governor of Quebec. He and Gage have like a close friendship that you can kind of see in these letters. There's a couple of letters I recall where the two of them are like bantering back and forth. One of them starts using sarcasm, which never occurs in this collection. Mrs. Gage is often brought up when Gage is like writing to a friend, or he receives a letter from a friend. James Murray uses this like professional correspondence to invite Mrs. Gage to Canada. When Mrs. Gage gives birth to their first son, like James Murray will write like, I hope Mrs. Gage and the little soldier are doing well. And so it's like those personal, like intimate moments in this very professional collection definitely surprised me.
Again,
Do you
sort of,
have any?
oh, so sorry, Angela, what?
No, no, that's what I was going to say. Do you have any, Cheney?
Well, every time I open any box of any collection at the Clements Library, I find something that I am entirely unfamiliar with. And it's a new story about a new person or something tantalizing that hasn't been explored thoroughly yet, or there's no other paperwork associated with it except this one piece. So, you know, one example I give, and I gave it in the grant application as well, is um, you know, the social and cultural history that's permeates this collection is often not thought of in the face of it being administrative paperwork. But, you know, some of the examples that Tulin, Katrina, and Michelle just gave are, I mean, a lot of that's social stuff and cultural stuff. So even in a document that's something like a clothing return, where there's a list of people who are receiving supplies in the way of clothes. So in the fall of 1764, there's Bouquet's Treaty, part of which involves the return of so-called Native American captives to the eastern seaboard, to civilization, like people who had been captured and brought into the lives of different native tribes are, as part of that treaty, they have to return to so-called civilization. And in those lists of clothing, for example, given to these people who have been wrested from places where they, you know, many of them had developed their own lives, and that's the community they know and live in, they have children and so on, they are taken out, they're given these clothes, they're returned to sort of the white civilization. And one line in one of those, for example, is a woman named Peggy, who's a mixed race person, who is given clothes and returned, it says, to the grandson of her former master. And who is Peggy? And her return to the east part of the colonies, you know, what is her, who is that, and what is her story? Her master, what does that mean precisely? And is this a person who had been enslaved and now is being returned to slavery through this treaty? I mean, the stories like those that are buried in documents isn't seemingly innocuous as, all right, we've got all these clothes that have got to go to somebody. That stuff really excites me and really I don't know, they're all avenues to explore for research and scholarship, and that's surprising and exciting every time one of those lines shows up.
Yes, thank you. Robert is sort of following up. We were talking about sending correspondence. Do we know what the number of weeks for a letter from Boston to London via ship was?
I can't tell you the number of weeks off the top of my head. And also I would say that it did vary. As I talked about, you know, they would send multiple copies in different ships, and it would depend on the ship when it got there. So yeah, I wish I knew the average, but I don't. I would say that's probably something you can look at the dockets of the letters that are currently online in the English series, and that's something that you could probably see yourself, because that is sending things from the American colonies to England, and you can see, you know, how long it took.
Month-ish, little over a month, maybe. There's exciting scholarship going on at this very moment respecting British paperwork and its movement during this time period. And I really look forward to reading at least one book that will be coming out that has content, you know, that really fleshes out some of that information. There's dissertation work being done by, one of our fellows came in who was particularly interested in identifying and tracking the time periods that it took for the movement of papers and the receipt of information overseas. I don't know, it's all fascinating to me, but it does vary, as Katrina said, on ship and on lots of external factors. But yeah.
So Cheryl's asking about the wealthy collectors from post-World War I and whether there's any good books or articles about them. And I know we certainly have, our pioneer Americanists and some other things that gather some information about people who were collecting around Americana. But do you have any other suggestions, anyone?
Cheryl, your follow-up was good, and not just individual stories is kind of I don't know of any, and if anybody can recommend one to me, one that sort of focuses, or a study that's particularly on that sort of period and phenomenon on that subject specifically. When it comes to Americana collectors, but in this case, it is kind of heavily geared towards printed materials, but our former director's sort of consolidated volume of focusing on individual collectors. I mean, those Pioneer Americanists is a really nice place to start at finding out who's who and sort of what they were doing. But if anybody knows of a study, I'd love to read it. That's broader than just one or two collectors.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting. All right. Tom, I guess one last question. Tom was asking about whether Gage supported loyalist militia during the early time of the revolution. Do we have any information about his interactions with the loyalists?
I don't have a specific answer about the militias. Gage was definitely supportive of loyalists, in different capacities, both during his time in America and after he returned to England. But his specific relationship with particular militias is something I'd have to investigate to give anything like a broad, picture of it. Or even the specific examples. That's just not something I know of off the top of my head. Have you come across anything, Katrina, Michelle, about the loyalist militias?
I would say not about militias that I can think of. I've seen him talk about loyalists, and one thing that stands out to me is, I think it's in some sort of correspondence that he sends to England, where he really underscores how difficult getting intelligence is from loyalists and how much they are risking to give it to him. So
I've come across some intelligence reports, and many of them are unsigned and there's no locality information. Now, whether these were from people who were in militias or just people sympathetic to the British, I don't know, since they're unsigned. But this kind of goes along with surprising things you find, because it's very detailed as to where troops are located, where people are moving, where some of the colonists are, what type of weaponry they've got. So that's something that adds another dimension for me to this, at least. And postal riders, I've come across accounts of postal riders being mobbed by colonists and being attacked for trying to get the mail through. So there's all sorts of things. Again, whether or not these people were, well, the colonists weren't in militias, but what their relationships were to anybody else around there, or what they were doing. A lot of other interesting accounts of interactions, shall we say, between colonists and the postal riders.
Interesting. All right. Well, I think we've definitely come to the end of our time. Thank you so much for everyone who logged on and asked such wonderful questions. And thank you to all of you for providing this wonderful look at this collection and what goes into digitizing it. So I know everyone is going to be excited to see more of it as it's loaded online. So great work and thank you so much. Have a great weekend, everyone.